All right, guys, let's get to it. Rise of isolationism. The United States is dominated by most Americans believing in isolationism, that we should not intervene, right, in the affairs of foreign countries. So please remember that. In the 1930s, it's isolationism versus interventionism. And really, FDR is the only prominent interventionist in the United States at this time. So the president in charge of foreign policy is struggling, right, with the opposing view for most of his own people. How does this grow in the 30s? Well, there's a lot of bitter memories for the American people from World War One, right? If you can recall, Wilson had won re-election in 1960 by promising that he had kept us out of the war, and yet in his second term we end up in the war. In that very brief period of World War One, we lost over 100,000 men, and Europe was still a mess, right? In the 20s. So in the 1930s, there's something called the Nye Committee in Congress, and they begin to investigate and unveil to the public, right? What were the reasons America got involved in World War One? And through their investigations, the public is kind of stunned to hear stuff we've already covered, right? That bankers had loaned so much money to the powers in Europe in World War One that we were committed, right, financially to intervening at some point. And this so angered the American public that it got Congress to pass a series of laws in the 30s known as the Neutrality Acts. And this is important that you remember. The Neutrality Acts did several different things. Number one, it prevented America from selling weapons to foreign powers. This is an arms embargo. Remember, we had not done that in World War One. We were one of the biggest weapons sellers, during World War One. So we don't want that again. Number two, it made clear that America was a neutral power, so our people had neutral rights. They shouldn't be harmed by powers in conflict. But it also made clear that we were not free to do whatever we pleased, right, as neutral citizens. Basically, this is an attempt to kind of tell the American people, you're protected under neutrality, but you can't violate the neutrality. They don't want a repeat of the Lusitania, which we talked about. And the third thing it did was cash and carry. So we're still, a global trade partner, right? And it's likely countries are going to clash with each other. So if those countries want to buy goods that aren't, weapons, right, food, medicine, whatever, cash and carry basically said they're allowed to do that, but they have to pay upfront now, no IOUs, right? So we're not forced to collect debt or anything like that. And you have to come get those goods. So we're not going to risk American sailors, even if you're buying from us, right? You have to come get it. So the Neutrality Act severely hampered any sort of attempted efforts by FDR to do anything, in the 30s, right? As it becomes clear that war increasingly is likely down the road, and conflict is spreading. In 1935, Mussolini in Italy invades Ethiopia. The League of Nations does nothing to stop it, ultimately showing that it is not achieving its real core purpose, right, to stop global conflict. In 1936, Spain has a civil war, which we talked about. Franco starts it. He asks for help from Hitler and Mussolini, gets it, and the only help on the other side, right, the side of the Republican government in Spain, is Stalin and the Soviet Union through this policy of the Popular Front, right, trying to get us, England, the United States, France, involved, and it doesn't work. And then by 1937, Japan begins a full-scale invasion of China with, again, horrific effects on the civilians, right? And you can actually see that in all three countries, Ethiopia, Spain, and China. One big new reality of war in this period is that the new tactics, new weapons result in horrific costs on civilians, which had not really been seen to the same level in World War One. Again, in China, you have horrific episodes like the Nanking Massacre, Nanjing Massacre, where thousands and thousands of civilians are brutally murdered, including women and children. This is something that stuns, right, FDR and most Americans. FDR is so taken aback, right, by the reports that are coming out of China following the Japanese invasion that he decides to go as far as delivering a speech kind of condemning it. It's known as the quarantine speech, and this is just one famous quote from it. And you would assume that something, this sort of tame, right, in light of the sort of, effect of war on civilians, right, the misery, the poverty, the death, right, that the country would kind of just take this for what it is and maybe even agree with it, and that's not the case, right? Most Americans hear the speech, and even those who voted for FDR criticize him for it. They believe that this is sort of a backdoor effort to get America involved in foreign affairs, where Americans at this time, most of them, definitely do not want that. So the quarantine speech is not met with support within the United States. What's actually happening in Germany? I'm going to go through this kind of quick. I would encourage you to, again, check out the links in the PowerPoint. Hitler calls Germany under his control the Third Reich, right? This Third German Empire. He wants to basically grow it. That's really the core belief here. And he kind of goes about doing that. In 1933, again, as he becomes, chancellor, there's that fire in the Reichstag, and then he becomes this sort of dictator after that. After purging Germany of enemies, right, and killing his opponents and arresting dissidents and all that, the Nazis begin an aggressive policy of remilitarization. This is one of the ways in which the Nazi Party told the German people that they were going to leave the misery of the Depression, right? 35% unemployment in Germany, and put people back to work, right? Public works projects, you're going to build factories and dams and roads. In fact, the German highway, the Autobahn, right, is started during this period. And you're going to reopen factories, right, and basically build up a new modern military, right? Tanks, planes, guns, all of it. And what's interesting is that in the remilitarization of Germany, there is cooperation by German corporations. Again, fascists are not communists, right? They're not to destroy personal property. And so today we have modern German companies that have historical connections, right, to the Nazi Party. Mercedes made cars for the Gestapo, the secret police of Germany. BMW had made airplane engines for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, under the Nazis. And Hugo Boss, the clothing company, had made the Nazi uniforms, right, for the Third Reich. In 1935, the Nazis also start to get laws passed that embrace their sort of view on race, which at its core ultimately is Aryans are superior, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, right, ethnic Germans, and everyone else is kind of inferior, but the specific group that's the most dangerous, that needs to kind of be isolated, right, are Jews. And they literally put out a process in which how do you identify and define who's a Jew, who's not, and what they can and cannot do. And this resulted in the breakup of marriages, right? This resulted in neighbors reporting on each other and outing each other. This resulted in new passports and identification, all of that. Really scary stuff. So check out that link at the U.S. Holocaust Museum website. Now, by 1936, Hitler's ready to start moving, okay? And I'm going to move on ahead so we can look at that. His first target here is the Rhineland on the left between Germany and France. After World War I's over, Treaty of Versailles says Germany's to blame. You owe money, reparations, most of which they can't pay. So part of the reparations was the French going into the Rhineland, taking this land, which was German, which had German families there, mines and so on, and taking that wealth and resource for itself. In 1936, Hitler gets the armies to swear an oath to him personally. That is a very scary moment when looking back, because it basically means that anything this guy says, you're compelled to follow through because you swore to. And that's going to be something that comes up in the Nuremberg trials, right, at the end of the war. He tells the German armies and their generals, send in men, retake the Rhineland in 1936. They are so scared, right, that this is a bad decision, that there are secret orders, we now know, sent to German units at that front, that if you are met by a single shot, right, by the French occupiers, again, in the Rhineland, you are to fall back. And Hitler's gamble works. They march in, they retake the Rhineland, there's no opposition, and the French leave it. And Hitler is seen as a genius, right, a visionary. And this further strengthens the cult of personality, right, the popularity of Hitler within the military and within the German public, right, that he got back this chunk of the nation, brought these people back into the Third Reich, and struck one chain, right, off the Treaty of Versailles. After taking the Rhineland, Hitler is determined to kind of continue expanding, right? He wants all German people within the Reich, and his next focus is Austria, right here. This is German propaganda. The official term for the annexation of Austria, right, the taking of Austria into Germany, was called Anschluss, and it was achieved in 1938. And shockingly enough, a lot of Austrians supported it. A couple of reasons why. Number one, Hitler himself is Austrian, not German. Number two, Austrians are basically ethnic Germans. They share a lot of cultural traditions with the German people, and they speak German. And so there is a lot of widespread support for kind of joining this prosperous Third Reich in the 30s, right? Support for the Nazi Party. And sadly today, when you look at, you know, views of fascism and positive, memories of the Nazis of the 30s, there's a hotbed of that still in Austria today. Okay, what else do we see? One big part of Nazi propaganda and rhetoric and all of that was anti-Semitism, right? Hatred against Jews. The Jews were seen as the great enemy by the Nazis, right? And Hitler's propaganda minister, Goebbels, a big part of his work was kind of instilling that, right? Mistrust, hatred against the Jewish people. On the left, you see here The Eternal Jew. This is a movie poster, an anti-Semitic movie, emphasizing sort of deepest held, hatreds against the Jews, right? That they are greedy moneylenders, they are responsible for the evils of communism, they're unclean, right? And so on. On the right, you see the cover of a textbook known as The Poison Mushroom. And this is another anti-Semitic book, but it's a kid's book. And this was widely published by the Nazi Party and pretty much mandated in German elementary schools during the period of Nazi control. And this is an example of some of the sort of messaging lessons in the book, again, promoted to German children in the 30s. This is a young boy brought in front of his classroom to sort of explain how to identify, Jews, right, in public. This is the sideward profile of a Jewish nose. The six, which in the Bible is associated with the mark of the beast, right? This sort of devilish creature, 666. Again, the front of a Jewish face, right? Exaggerated facial features. And again, Star of David, the symbol of the Jewish faith, right? Again, today we would call this scapegoating, but if you can get the public to believe that one group is responsible for all these problems, right? It becomes an effective means of mass control. And there's a long, long history in Europe of anti-Semitism that goes, as far as the Middle Ages, right? That the Nazi Party basically uses and then expands upon, right? While they're in power. With the success of Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, there is an event known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November of 1938. And this is a very famous photograph of basically the aftermath of it. What ends up happening is 267 synagogues are burned, 7,500 Jewish stores and businesses destroyed, 91 Jewish people murdered, and 30,000 people arrested and sent to concentration camps. These are Jewish men forced by the community to clean up the mess of Kristallnacht. So they're not only forced to clean up, right, the destruction of their businesses and synagogues and homes, but then in Austria and Germany, they blame them for the violence, right, and they're the victims of it. And this is really kind of a big wake-up call to a lot of Jews who were still living in Austria and Germany, who thought this would pass or go away, or this wasn't possible, right, to get worse, that they don't want you at this point, the Nazi authorities. They want you to leave. And what follows is even more sort of restrictive measures. And all of you have seen this in TV or film or photographs, the yellow star on the jacket. And this is actually a direct line from the bill itself. Whoever bears a sign is an enemy of our people. So Jews have not only been forced to identify on passports and stuff that they were Jewish, right? But now in public at all times, they have to bear this visible yellow star. So anyone at a glance can know that they're a Jew. And this is associated with being an enemy of the people. Okay, this was also extended to other undesirable groups by the Nazis. So Jews obviously are the worst, right? But they also lump in homosexuals. They wore pink stars, gypsies, communists, people of mixed race origin, and so on. So another part that we don't often talk about is the Nazis also made clear that they wanted to purge Germany of any weak elements. And one of the first groups Hitler went after and actually exterminated, euthanized, were people with physical and mental disabilities in hospitals in the early 30s. He had, medical facilities euthanize them and then lie to their parents once their parents couldn't find where their children were. So this is really twisted ideology, but it's a core part of Hitler's, reign as dictator of Germany. Okay, so this is Germany. this is kind of all the land they've taken right up until this point, and now they have their eyes set on Czechoslovakia, specifically the areas in red known as the Sudetenland. There are ethnic